Thank you for these blessings, Lord.
France's presence in Africa is a complex tapestry woven from threads of colonialism, intervention, and a persistent belief in its role as a guiding hand. The echoes of empire still resonate across the continent, shaping relationships between France and its former colonies. This investigation delves into the murky waters of this enduring influence, focusing on France's recent military maneuvers in Guinea. It's a story of clandestine operations, political expediency, and the enduring struggle for power and influence in a region grappling with its past and uncertain future. From the halls of the Élysée Palace to the dusty plains of the Sahel, the shadow of France's colonial legacy looms large. The ghosts of past interventions whisper through the corridors of power, reminding us of the enduring ties that bind France to its former African possessions. This investigation seeks to shed light on these ties, examining the motivations behind France's actions and the implications for the future of Franco-African relations. The story begins in Guinea, a nation grappling with its own turbulent history and a recent coup that has reshaped the political landscape. Mamadi Doumbouya, a former French legionnaire, now leads Guinea, a nation on the edge of authoritarianism. His ascent to power, seen by some as a necessary change, has been overshadowed by violence and repression. For France, Doumbouya is a strategic asset, a defense against instability and a potential ally in its quest for regional influence. Doumbouya's background as a French-trained soldier has created a strong connection with Paris, one that has grown since he took power. France has quickly renewed military cooperation with Conakry, offering training and support to the forces accused of human rights abuses. This alliance, born out of realpolitik, raises serious questions about France's commitment to democracy and human rights in Africa. Is France ignoring the abuses of its new ally for the sake of strategic advantage? The situation in Guinea is further complicated by the ongoing crisis in neighboring Mali, where France's decade-long military intervention has ended in a bitter divorce. The expulsion of French troops from Mali, driven by a wave of anti-French sentiment, and the rise of a military junta with ties to Russia has sent shockwaves through Paris. France's hasty withdrawal from its former colony, leaving behind a security vacuum that threatens to further destabilize the region, has raised questions about its long-term strategy in Africa. The spectre of Mali hangs heavy over France's actions in Guinea, a cautionary tale of the perils of intervention and the limits of military power. The French government, determined to prevent a repeat of the Malian debacle, appears to be doubling down on its support for Doumbouya, viewing him as a crucial ally in its efforts to contain the spread of jihadism and counter Russian influence in the region. This investigation will examine the extent of France's military involvement in Guinea, uncovering the clandestine operations and secret agreements that underpin this burgeoning alliance. The relationship between France and Guinea is a tumultuous one, marked by the bitter legacy of colonialism, a brief post-independence honeymoon, and decades of mistrust and resentment. Guinea, once a prized possession in France's vast West African empire, became a symbol of African resistance to colonial rule when it voted overwhelmingly for independence in 1958. This bold rejection of French authority, led by the charismatic Ahmed Sékou Touré, ushered in an era of estrangement between the two nations. Touré's socialist government, suspicious of French intentions, severed ties with its former colonizer, nationalized French companies, and embarked on a path of non-alignment during the Cold War. France, for its part, viewed Touré's regime with hostility, accused it of human rights abuses, and allegedly supported attempts to destabilize the Guinean government. This period of animosity cast a long shadow over Franco-Guinean relations, sowing the seeds of mistrust that linger to this day. The death of Touré in 1984 and the subsequent rise of Lansana Conté, a military officer who promised to return to closer ties with France, offered a glimmer of hope for a thaw in relations. Section 2, The Seeds of Discord, Mali, and the Unraveling of French Influence. While France grappled with the complexities of its relationship with Guinea, a parallel drama was unfolding in neighboring Mali. Once a beacon of stability in the Sahel, Mali descended into chaos in 2012 following a coup d'etat and a Tuareg rebellion in the north, which created a power vacuum that allowed Islamist militants to seize control of vast swathes of territory. France, fearing the emergence of a jihadist safe haven in its former colony, launched Operation Serval in 2013, a military intervention aimed at repelling the Islamist advance. What began as a rapid and seemingly successful operation soon morphed into a protracted and costly counterinsurgency campaign. Despite the presence of thousands of French troops, the security situation in Mali continued to deteriorate. Jihadist groups, emboldened by their resilience and adept at exploiting local grievances, expanded their operations, carrying out deadly attacks on Malian and international forces, as well as targeting civilians. The French intervention, initially welcomed by many Malians, gradually lost its luster as the conflict dragged on. Public opinion turned against the French presence, fueled by perceptions of neo-colonialism, a sense that France was more interested in protecting its own interests than in stabilizing Mali, and allegations of human rights abuses committed by French forces. Section 3, A New Hope, A New Risk, Doumbouya and the French Gamble. It is against this backdrop of regional instability and waning French influence that Mamadi Doumbouya seized power in Guinea in September 2021. A former French legionnaire with a reputation for ruthlessness, Doumbouya's coup, which ousted the aging and increasingly autocratic Alpha Condé, was met with a mixture of hope and trepidation. While some welcomed the overthrow of Condé's regime, which had become synonymous with corruption and repression, others feared that Doumbouya's rule would usher in a new era of authoritarianism. For France, Doumbouya's rise to power presented both an opportunity and a risk. On the one hand, Doumbouya's military background, his fluency in French, and his personal ties to France suggested a potential ally, someone who might be more receptive to French interests than his predecessor. On the other hand, Doumbouya's lack of political experience, his authoritarian tendencies, and the potential for instability in Guinea under his rule gave Paris pause. The French government, eager to find new partners in the region following its expulsion from Mali, opted to embrace Doumbouya, calculating that his regime, despite its flaws, offered the best hope for stability in Guinea and a bulwark against the spread of jihadism and Russian influence. Section 1. Whispers in the Jungle. The secret presence in Soronconi. Deep in the heart of the Guinean jungle, far from the prying eyes of international observers and human rights groups, lies the Soronconi military camp, a place shrouded in secrecy and whispered rumors. Here, amidst the dense foliage and the stifling heat, a contingent of French soldiers, their presence officially unacknowledged, trains and equips the elite forces of Mamadi Doumbouya's regime. Their mission to transform the Guinean military into a formidable force capable of crushing dissent, securing the country's porous borders, and safeguarding French interests in the region. The very existence of this clandestine training program, denied by both French and Guinean authorities, speaks volumes about the true nature of the relationship between the two countries. It is a relationship built not on mutual respect and shared values, but on expediency, realpolitik, and a shared determination to maintain French influence in a region where its grip is slipping. The presence of French soldiers in Soronconi, training the very units accused of carrying out human rights abuses against Guinean citizens, raises troubling questions about France's commitment to democratic principles and its willingness to turn a blind eye to the excesses of its allies. Section 2. Training for Tyranny, French Forces and the Guinean Elite. The French military trainers stationed in Soronconi do not limit themselves to providing basic combat skills to their Guinean counterparts. They are also engaged in a more insidious form of instruction, one that focuses on the techniques of repression, control, and the suppression of dissent. They share their expertise in intelligence gathering, surveillance, and crowd control, equipping the Guinean security forces with the tools and tactics needed to maintain a tight grip on power and silence any voices of opposition. The Guinean soldiers who undergo this specialized training, handpicked for their loyalty to Doumbouya and their ruthlessness, form the backbone of the regime's repressive apparatus. They are deployed to quell protests, intimidate journalists, and silence human rights activists. They operate with impunity, knowing that they have the backing of their French patrons who turn a blind eye to their abuses in the name of stability and strategic interests. Section 3. The Malian Shadow, Countering Jihadism or Currying Favor. The French government claims its military presence in Guinea is to combat terrorism and to prevent the spread of jihadist groups from neighboring Mali. However, there is growing suspicion that these claims are a pretext for a more cynical agenda. France, eager to reassert its influence in the region after its expulsion from Mali, sees in Doumbouya a compliant ally, willing to grant access to Guinean territory and resources in exchange for military support and political backing. Guinea's strategic location, bordering several countries grappling with jihadist insurgencies, makes it valuable in the fight against terrorism. Yet there is little evidence to suggest that Guinea itself faces a significant jihadist threat. Many argue that the real danger comes not from Islamist militants, but from the Guinean government itself, which uses the spectre of terrorism to justify its own brutality and consolidate its grip on power. France's willingness to overlook Doumbouya's human rights abuses and its support for his repressive regime raises serious questions about its true motives in Guinea. Section 4. A pawn in a bigger game. Guinea's uncertain future in the grip of power politics. Guinea, caught in the crosshairs of international power politics, risks becoming a pawn in a game played by more powerful actors. France, eager to maintain its influence over its former colonies and counter the growing presence of Russia and China in Africa, sees in Doumbouya a useful ally, a strongman willing to cooperate in exchange for military aid and political support. Doumbouya, for his part, is all too willing to leverage this relationship, using French backing to strengthen his own power and suppress dissent. The Guinean people, meanwhile, find themselves caught in a struggle not of their own making. Their hopes for a more democratic and prosperous future, briefly ignited by Doumbouya's coup, have been shattered by authoritarianism and foreign meddling. The international community, preoccupied with other crises and driven by its own strategic interests, seems content to turn a blind eye as Guinea spirals into repression and violence. The price of dissent, a crackdown in Conakry. The streets of Conakry, once alive with the vibrant energy of a nation yearning for change, now bear the scars of a brutal crackdown on dissent. Mamadi Doumbouya, his promises of a return to democratic rule ringing hollow, has unleashed the full force of the Guinean security forces against those who dare to question his authority. Protests, once a regular feature of Guinean political life, have been met with brutal force, the air thick with tear gas and the crackle of gunfire. Those who dare to raise their voices against Doumbouya's regime do so at their peril. Journalists are intimidated, harassed and imprisoned for reporting on sensitive issues. Opposition leaders are silenced, forced into exile, or disappear without a trace. Human rights activists, once a beacon of hope in a country plagued by impunity, are hunted down, their organizations shuttered, their voices stifled. Vanished without a trace. The case of Fonike. Mengue and Biloba. The case of Fonike Mengue and Biloba, two prominent activists abducted from their homes by armed men in plain clothes, is emblematic of the climate of fear that has descended upon Guinea. Mengue, a charismatic leader of the National Front for the Defense of the Constitution, and Ba, a respected human rights activist, had been vocal critics of the Doumbouya regime, denouncing its human rights abuses and demanding a return to constitutional order. Their abduction, witnessed by terrified family members, sent shockwaves through Guinean civil society. Despite pleas from their families, human rights organizations, and international bodies, The Guinean authorities have remained tight-lipped about the fate of the two activists. No charges have been filed, no access to lawyers or family members has been granted, and the government has refused to confirm their whereabouts or even acknowledge their detention. French whispers in Guinean ears. The role of foreign advisors. As Doumbouya tightens his grip on power and cracks down on dissent, a shadowy network of foreign advisors, many of them French, operate behind the scenes, whispering in the ears of the Guinean security forces. They provide training, equipment, and strategic advice, helping to mold the Guinean military into a formidable instrument of repression. These foreign advisors, often former soldiers or intelligence operatives, bring with them a wealth of experience gleaned from years of operating in some of the world's most volatile regions. They are experts in counterinsurgency, surveillance, and psychological operations, and their presence in Guinea raises troubling questions about the role of foreign powers in propping up authoritarian regimes. Section 4. A blind eye to brutality, France's complicated calculus. France's unwavering support for the Doumbouya regime, despite its abysmal human rights record, is driven by a complex calculus of strategic interests, economic considerations, and a deep-seated belief in its own indispensability in its former colonies. Having been unceremoniously ejected from Mali, France is determined to avoid a similar fate in Guinea, a country rich in mineral resources and strategically located on the West African coast. But France's support for Doumbouya goes beyond mere pragmatism. It is also a reflection of a deeply ingrained paternalism, a belief that France knows best when it comes to managing the affairs of its former colonies. This paternalistic attitude, rooted in the colonial past, blinds France to the realities of the situation in Guinea, preventing it from seeing that its support for Doumbouya is only serving to exacerbate the very problems it claims to be addressing. Section 1. The Voices of Resistance. A nation pushes back. Despite the climate of fear and repression that has enveloped Guinea, the spirit of resistance flickers on, fueled by the courage of ordinary citizens who refuse to be silenced. From the bustling markets of Conakry to the remote villages nestled in the foothills of the Fouta Djallon, a groundswell of opposition to Doumbouya's rule is building, challenging the regime's narrative and demanding a return to democratic principles. Student groups, once at the forefront of the struggle for democracy, continue to mobilize, organizing clandestine meetings, distributing leaflets, and using social media to spread their message of defiance. Trade unions, despite facing intimidation and threats, have staged strikes and demonstrations, demanding better working conditions and an end to corruption. And in a society where women's voices are often marginalized, Guinean women have taken to the streets in their thousands, their vibrant clothing and defiant chants a powerful symbol of resistance. The Guinean diaspora too has played a crucial role in amplifying the voices of dissent, organizing protests in front of Guinean embassies and international organizations, and using their platforms to raise awareness about the situation in their homeland. Section 2. A Mother's Plea, the Search for Justice and the Silence of France. Amidst the chorus of voices demanding change in Guinea, one voice stands out for its raw emotion and quiet dignity. The voice of Isatou Diallo, the mother of Fonike Menga, the abducted activist. Since her son's disappearance, Madame Diallo has become a tireless advocate for his release and a symbol of the human cost of Doumbouya's repression. Her pleas for information about her son's whereabouts have been met with silence from the Guinean authorities. Her requests to visit him in detention to ensure that he is being treated humanely have been ignored, and her calls for justice, for those responsible for his abduction to be held accountable, have gone unanswered. Yet Madame Diallo refuses to be cowed, her grief fueling her determination to find her son and to hold those who have wronged her family accountable. Section 3. The Emperor's New Clothes, Unmasking the Myth of French Moral Authority. France, which has long prided itself on being a beacon of democracy and human rights, has found itself increasingly isolated on the international stage as its support for the Doumbouya regime has come under growing scrutiny. The images of Guinean protesters being beaten, tear-gassed, and shot by security forces trained and equipped by France, have tarnished its image as a defender of liberty and exposed the hypocrisy at the heart of its Africa policy. The French government's attempts to justify its continued support for Doumbouya, citing the need to combat terrorism and counter Russian influence, have rung hollow in the ears of many observers. The reality, they argue, is that France is more interested in protecting its own economic and strategic interest than in promoting democracy and human rights in Guinea. The situation in Guinea has exposed the limits of France's influence in its former colonies and laid bare the contradictions inherent in its self-proclaimed role as a force for good in the world. Guinea at the crossroads. Once a forgotten backwater in the eyes of the world, Guinea now finds itself thrust onto the center stage of geopolitics, its fate intertwined with the ambitions of global powers vying for influence and control. The country's vast mineral wealth, its strategic location on the West African coast, and its role as a linchpin in the fight against terrorism have made it a prize worth fighting for, a pawn in a high-stakes game played by actors with little regard for the well-being of the Guinean people. France, long accustomed to calling the shots in its former colonies, now faces stiff competition from new players, eager to challenge its dominance and reshape the rules of engagement. Russia, eager to reassert its presence on the African continent and exploit the growing anti-French sentiment in the region, has made significant inroads in Guinea, offering military hardware, security guarantees, and a narrative of anti-imperialism that resonates with some segments of the population. Section 2. The Russian Gambit, a new player in the Great Game. Russia's expanding influence in Guinea is raising alarms for France and its Western allies. Moscow's strategy, refined through engagements in Syria, Ukraine, and the Central African Republic, involves a mix of military support, disinformation campaigns, and economic leverage to build alliances, disrupt Western interests, and extend its influence. In Guinea, Russia has found an eager ally in Mamadi Doumbouya, who views Moscow as a counterbalance to French pressure and a source of legitimacy for his troubled regime. Russian mercenaries associated with the Wagner Group, a covert private military company with close Kremlin ties, have been seen in Guinea, offering security for Doumbouya and training his elite forces. Section 3. Beyond the Horizon, charting a new course for France and Africa. The situation in Guinea exemplifies the broader challenges France faces as it seeks to redefine its relationship with its former colonies in a rapidly evolving world. The old paradigm, where France could depend on its historical ties, economic leverage, and military strength to exert influence, is disintegrating, giving way to a more dynamic and multipolar world where new players with their own agendas and ambitions are competing for influence. If France aims to remain a significant player in Africa, it must abandon its paternalistic approach and adopt a more equitable and mutually beneficial partnership with the continent. This involves listening to the concerns of African partners, respecting their sovereignty, and supporting their aspirations for democracy, development, and good governance. Section 1. The stained legacy repercussions of France's military maneuvers. France's covert military actions in Guinea, cloaked in secrecy and driven by a desire for sustained influence, have overshadowed the country's delicate democracy. The murmurs of French boots on Guinean soil, the reverberations of gunfire in the jungle, and the concealed disappearances of those who dared to speak out all depict a grim picture of a nation ensnared in a neo-colonial struggle. This investigation has stripped away the layers of plausible deniability, revealing the harsh truth of France's role in supporting a regime that thrives on repression and silences its critics with force. The people of Guinea, longing for freedom and good governance, find themselves mere pawns in a geopolitical chess game, their dreams sacrificed on the altar of expediency and realpolitik. The French government, blinded by its own strategic interests and a misguided sense of paternalism, has failed to understand the long-term consequences of its actions. By aligning itself with a regime that tramples on human rights and disregards the rule of law, France has not only betrayed its own values, but has also planted the seeds of instability and resentment that could haunt the region for years to come. Section 2, a continent in flux navigating the shifting sands of power.